So let me start by stating the obvious. The term public health is subject to many, many definitions. Not everyone agrees. I'm going to share with you a definition, one that I have used and I have found useful, but I invite you to challenge that. Particularly in the history of public health, the most problematic part of everything has been that little adjective public, right? If we think that health is complex, it is complex, and our next session will be entirely devoted to trying to explore the meanings of health. But the adjective we use to qualify health, which is public, has been subject to a lot of interpretations. And let me just ask you, how do you think about that word public? What do you interpret when we say public? What's your own definition of public? Now, historically, public has been used to mean the government, as in the public sector. Public has also been used to mean the community, like when we talk about the public, we're here to serve the public, so it means the collectivity, right? And then we often use the word public to mean something big, For example, I remember at the beginning, many of you work on AIDS, right? But you're too young maybe to remember when the first cases appeared a little bit more than 30 years ago. So someone said, AIDS is really becoming a public health problem, because now there were many cases, right? So before it was not public health because only a few people were there. So very often we use the term public health, especially this is in the lay usage of the word. This has become a public health problem means this has become a large problem. It affects a lot of people. I think and both in the literature and in the lay usage of the term public health, you will see those meanings used. Very often they're associated, for example, in the US, typically you had a publicly run, government run, in that sense public services, addressing some of the public's biggest problems. Especially and especially when there was this divide between curative services, mostly led by the private sector, and then the government would do the public health side of that. These usages are still very prevalent. And the main message is that although all of those are important dimensions of our understanding of public health, the essence of public health is the level of analysis. And that we should interpret the word public to mean population. That is what public means. And I was delighted to see that in the word map, the word population was one of the most commonly used words. It's the idea that public health takes an entire population, and that is the essence of what's public in public health. Now, I said before that we must think of public health as a field of inquiry and as an arena for action. And let me start when we think of it as a field of inquiry, as public health research, because it allows us to think clearly on what this question of being a level of analysis means. What does that mean? So when we talk about the public health, I have found it very helpful to distinguish between the objects of analysis and the levels of analysis. And when we think about what is the object of analysis, when we do research, a simplified way of thinking about health is that when we talk about health, we're always talking about, on the one hand, health conditions, what happens to individuals or to populations, and about the responses to these conditions, okay? This is a simplification, but you're either thinking about the diseases, risk factors, or physiological conditions or states of well-being that we categorize as health. Typically, these are diseases. Or we think about the way a society responds. And by response, I do not mean the internal physiopathological response to a disease agent. I mean the external social response to those conditions. And then those conditions and responses can happen at least three levels of analysis. The sub-individual and individual level, sub-individual meaning components of individuals, organs, cells, cellular elements, and even molecules, or at the population level. And what we've agreed is that what defines public health is that level of analysis. So this provides a simple typology of the forms of health research. Biomedical research is by and large concerned with the understanding of health conditions, the causes and mechanisms of disease, mostly at the sub-individual level. Clinical research, by and large, studies the diagnostic, preventive diagnostic, and therapeutic response to those conditions fundamentally at the individual level. Now, public health studies the same objects, but the difference is the level of analysis. And what we call epidemiological research, including all forms of epidemiological research, is mostly concerned with the study of the frequency, distribution, and determinants of health conditions in populations. And finally, health systems research, the other part of public health research, studies the organized social response to health conditions, the way a society responds through a health system. Okay? So this is a simplified typology, but allows us to think. Now, there's many elements in between. For example, there's a whole question of behaviors. Now, behaviors can be both part of the conditions, the determinants of a condition. You know, if I smoke, that's a behavior that becomes a risk factor, and therefore it's part of the conditions. Behaviors are also the trigger of the response, right? Both the behaviors of, say, an individual who decides to seek care and starts moving it, and the behaviors of the elements, the providers in the health system. So you have behaviors right there in the middle. And then you have many fields that are exactly on the interface. For example, clinical epidemiology really tries to integrate clinical research and epidemiological research, as the name implies. You have a very interesting field of bioepidemiology, which uses insights from the biological sciences and many variants, molecular epidemiology, genetic epidemiology, that uses understanding coming from biomedical research and applies that, for example, the use of biomarkers in populations. And then, of course, the comparative effectiveness research, a very, very large field that straddles clinical and health systems research. So this is, you know, when I said that all models are simplification, this shows that. But it is useful to think, you know, that I said before, a framework is an abstract representation. In an abstract way, you are both dealing with the conditions and then with the response. And then you have these levels of analysis. The important message here, and the practical message, is that what distinguishes public health is not the objects, it's the level. And this is very important because very often public health, particularly those of you who come from the clinical side of healthcare, you know, there's this divorce because we think very often that we study something different in public health. No, it's the same objects, conditions and responses. We just do it at a different level. And operating at the population level doesn't mean that we forget that those populations are formed by individuals. Except a population is not just the sum of the individuals. There's interactions among the individuals, and there are population level phenomena that are not reducible to the individuals. But there are individuals in those populations, and not those individuals actually have a sub-individual reality. But the levels are not collapsible because of the interrelations. You know, just like a bodily system is not just the aggregation of organs, but it's the way those work together, and that's the difference between the sub-individual and the individual level. Similarly, it's the interactions of the individuals in a population, both the human and the interaction with other populations, like populations of microorganisms and other elements of the environment. And that's why contrary to a school of thought which is called reductionism, which is that if you understand the most basic level, you understand the others, because the others are just aggregations. So all we need to understand are molecules, and then we'll understand populations and societies. I do not subscribe to that view because each level includes not just the components of the level below it, but the way they interact. Okay, and that's what's called systems thinking, and we will have a whole session on that. But this is a way to me to appreciate the main components of public health.